I'm sure people may be trickling afterward, but I'm glad we have a great group here this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And it's my pleasure to be here at Brown and to have our special guest, Chris Inglis, who was the inaugural National Cyber Director in the Office of National Cyber Director, and a position that my colleagues and I in Congress created after a year-long process called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, of which Chris and I were commissioners, and which we worked on diligently in crafting the overarching strategy to better protect the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequence, which was the charge that we had given to us by Congress to create that strategy. And so, as a result, we had issued some 75 to 80 recommendations, and many of which were then collapsed into legislation that was introduced in Congress, and a significant number of those bills got through Congress and acted into law, and one of which, again, was the creation of the National Cyber Directive. So it's something I had been working on for about 10 years. It took me 10 years to finally get it through Congress, but eventually happened, and we are very fortunate that Chris was the inaugural Cyber Director. And we just completed a 5-week study course here at Brown, and it was basically surveying the cyber threat landscape and protecting the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequence, which was the title of the study group. So it was a wonderful experience for me, and I hope for the students as well that attended. But I know we have some cyber luminaries in the audience here. I see again the front row here of Brown's cyber program, and thank you for the work that you all are doing in cybersecurity and educating and preparing the next generation of cyber defenders. So thank you. Let me just read Chris's bio, if I could, and I'll just say that it's been a pleasure working with Chris over the years. I've kind of fell into the issue of cybersecurity back in around 2007, 2008, when I was chairing a subcommittee on the Homeland Security Committee that had jurisdiction over cyber, and it was never a field that I had intended to go into. So it was a bit, I guess, surprising to my two brothers who are both cybersecurity, who are both technology experts by training. One's has his master's, he's an electrical engineer, and then has his master's degree in computer science. My youngest brother is he has undergraduate degree in computer science, as well as a master's degree in computer science. It works for Bank of America. So mine was more of the policy side in training. Theirs was technical. So it's an interesting kind of convergence in our world. But having done national security work for most of my time in Congress, this is something I really enjoyed and I've gotten to know quite well in terms of the challenges we face protecting the country in this field. But let me just read Chris's bio briefly, and it's small print, so I'm going to squint to read it. But he served as the inaugural Senate-confirmed U.S. National Cyber Director from 2021 to 2023. As a commissioner he served also as a commissioner on the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and for 8 years as the Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of the National Security Agency from 2006 to 2014. During the period 2014 to 2021, he served as the Looker Professor of Cyber Studies at the U.S. Naval Academy, as a principal at Paladin Capital, as well as a member of the Department of Defense Science Board. He also served as a member of the U.S. Strategic Command Advisory Board, also as a member of Penn State Advanced Research Lab Advisory Board, as well as a trustee of the National Intelligence University. He also served as a member of several private and public boards of directors, including Answer, FedEx, Huntington Bank, Securonics, Trinity Cyber Solutions, Blackpoint, and Elbit. Mr. Inglis holds advanced degrees in engineering and computer science from Columbia University, the Johns Hopkins University, George Washington University, and has served on the faculties of both the U.S. Naval Academy, as well as the Military Academy at West Point. Mr. Inglis' military career includes 30 years of service in the U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard, from which he retired as a brigadier general. He holds ratings in the U.S. Air Force Command pilot and has been designated as a Distinguished Eagle Scout and Distinguished graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. So with that, welcome, Director. Thank you for being here. I know you're fresh off your stint as the nation's first National Cyber Director, as I mentioned, and we're just very fortunate to have you here to talk about your role and your work as the Cyber Director and your crowning achievement of creating the National Cyber Strategy and completing that work and seeing it forward to the President just prior to your leaving. So with that, welcome to Brown, and the floor is yours.
I'll just make a couple of very brief remarks. First, thanks for that overly generous introduction. You know, what my wife says is, surely across all of that, you must have been happy once. But having said that, I'd say that my background might lead you to conclude that cyber is a highly technical endeavor, given an engineering background, a computer science background, and work at the National Security Agency, which clearly deploys quite a lot of technology. And I think it's just the opposite. Perhaps my first provocative statement would be that I think cyber, getting it right, whatever it is, and we could discuss that in some detail, what cyber is, but getting it right requires more application of doctrinal thinking and perhaps getting the people skills in the right place than getting the technology in the right place. And I think that we've got that in the wrong order over the last 20, 30 years. We're in a continued tailspin trying to figure out what to do with the next iteration of technology. When what we ought to do first and foremost is to figure out why cyber matters, what we want it to do for us, how do we actually array the responsibilities, the accountability of who's doing what to whom, get the people skills in the right place, and then let technology meet our expectations. And so if it were me, king for a day, never been, never will be, but if I was king for a day, I would say we shouldn't elevate cyber in priority, we should subordinate it to the things we already care about. Because we already know what it is we want to do with digital infrastructure, whether it's your banking or manage your personal affairs, manage a business that needs to reach into things that you can never physically touch, whether it's supply chains or markets. All of that is why we care about the underlying digital infrastructure, and getting that in the right place perhaps is the ultimate, not penultimate, but the ultimate aim of cybersecurity. Having confidence that the digital infrastructure we use will do what we want it to do in all the positive ways and none of the negative. So I look forward to a rich discussion here, and hopefully the audience will help us take it to the corners that you prefer.
Sounds good. All right, thank you. So I guess I would start with explain your charge to stand up the Office of National Cyber Director, the steps you had to go through, and I guess, well, let's start with prior to that, the Solarium process. We should talk about that, maybe some of the high points on Solarium, and then again of the major recommendations that came out, one of which was creating this office, and then you were able to put your imprimatur on it as the first director, and what you had to go through to get the office up and running.
Yeah, so of course that job was born of years of work, and it wasn't straight line from kind of conception or kind of inspiration to the ultimate culmination of that. But perhaps the most proximate cause of the creation of that job was the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which of course you were on, and kind of 2 congressmen, 2 senators, and a few mere mortals. I happen to be one of the mere mortals on that committee. What I found interesting, new, novel, and rewarding about that commission was having been installed by law and expected by law to deliver a result that would speak to what cyber meant to the United States and what we should do about it. It was perhaps the most bipartisan, nonpartisan activity I've ever been associated with across 45 years of kind of public service. You could not tell who in the room was a Republican or a Democrat or had leanings to one side or the other. It was clear and apparent that Mike Gallagher rooted for the particular football team, the Green Bay Packers, at some point in time. But that was the only tension that ever entered into the room. There was unanimity about the importance of cyber to the conduct of our daily lives. And one of the things I think we concluded early in that study was that the only thing that could possibly get it back into the right place was to apply all of the capabilities, authorities, resources at our disposal to come up with what is oft described as a whole-of-nation approach, but to do that in the largest possible context, in international context. For the United States part, we came to the conclusion that there was much to be done, and we needed not a vertical that would ensure that got done, but rather a horizontal. How do you actually array all of those capabilities in a coalition of the willing to essentially move forward to get individuals, organizations, governments, plural, state, federal, kind of local, to do the things necessary to bring about desirable conditions in cyberspace. One of the recommendations inside of that was to create a national cyber director, whose purpose would be to create coherence, engender collaboration, private-public collaboration, not division of effort, and to have a focus on future resilience, not just present resilience, which was so often born on reacting well, kind of trying to put out today's fire. And so having helped throw that pass, kind of using a sports metaphor, I had no idea that I was the one that was going to catch it. But I did. I was nominated for that early part of 21, confirmed in the summer, early summer of 21, and did that job for 20 months. And the job essentially was what I've just described. How do you essentially help reset the government's thinking on that, born of efforts like the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission? How do you create the relationships that will essentially create the interstitial material across the federal enterprise and then out into the private sector, to include academia? And how do you then reset that in a durable fashion by crafting what we now know as the National Cybersecurity Strategy? So we did all of that in those first 20 months, and I'm pleased to say that the group that I've left behind is more capable still and is running the next lap in the implementation of that strategy, which again is the work of a coalition of the many, as opposed to the work of a single office or organization.
Very good. In the strategy itself, obviously that is going to be the guiding principle document going forward that will guide our actions, our spending. It'll engender oversight and hopefully buy-in of other parts of government to see this strategy fully realized. You want to talk about some of the highlights of it, because I noticed that the cyber strategy really proposes two fundamental shifts in how the United States allocates roles, responsibilities, and resources in cyberspace. The first is the rebalancing the responsibility to mitigating cybersecurity risks away from end users and toward those entities most capable of accepting and addressing those risks. And the second is to realign incentives to favor long-term investments that make cyberspace more resilient and defensible. I thought it'd be great.
So I think you've captured those accurately. I think it might be useful for anybody who wants to know more of the details about what was the motivation underneath that strategy. Mm-hmm. To go a little bit further back, I think it was about February of 2022, I and a fellow by the name of Harry Kresha wrote a paper for the Foreign Affairs Journal that essentially was declared as somewhat heretical at the time, made the case that we should have a positive aspiration for the role of cyber in our lives, not obsess overnight and in the morning about what bad things happened overnight, but focus once again on what it was we wanted cyber to do for us. And establishing that positive aspiration, which is not Pollyannish, but rather kind of inspirational to say, then are we willing to make the investments to bring it about, make the investments necessary to deliver the resilience and robustness that are required to have confidence that those systems will perform as expected. So that was really the predicate statement. Having said that, the document does the inevitable, which is it goes back to past practice to says, have we ever done this before? Of course we have. Right? We've done something similar for transportation systems. We've done something similar for drugs, for therapeutics, and so on and so forth, for other critical functions that are critical to the health, life, and safety of our citizens. We've essentially, ultimately, after trying all those other things, as Winston Churchill said, you can trust us to do the right thing after we've done all the wrong things. After doing all those other things, we've come back to the conclusion that inherent resilience and robustness is a requirement. You can't actually add that as an after-market item. And you have to actually assign roles and responsibilities such that we understand how we're taking advantage of every talent, every capability, every authority in the room. I'll just give the automobile kind of as an example. Often the focus on the automobile is about air safety bags, seat belts, anti-lock brakes. That's an important focus. That device, that kind of single artifact, has been designed so that it can play a proper role based on the technology that's in it. But that's not actually the transportation system. That's just one artifact of a much larger system. We actually take care to make sure that the person who's operating that vehicle is properly trained so that they understand what its limits are, what their roles and responsibilities might be. We all know we should put our hands at 10 and 2 o'clock position. I know you've all broken eye contact at this moment. You don't necessarily do that, but you know, right? You all know that you shouldn't drink and drive. It's a really bad idea. And so there's a human component to that, but that's not the end of it. There are road systems on which that car operates that are similarly engineered so that you can conduct yourself across that with every expectation you'll make it safely from your origination point to your destination point. Somebody's taking care to describe the standards for those road systems. Somebody's taking care to build them according to those standards. Somebody's taking care to administer and sustain those according to those standards. Somebody actually finds the significant transgressors on those road systems, whether they're drunk drivers or speeders or folks who will leave junk by the roadside, and take care of that. The points of influence to essentially create a resilient and robust transportation system, as opposed to the car itself, are many and varied, and they're spread across individuals, organizations, governments, plural, in a way that those all complement one another. And each of us plays a role in the sustainment of that kind of the properties of that system, to the point of even physical security. I made the point in an earlier discussion today that, I drove to the airport last night to make my way to Providence. I navigated that road system I just described using a device that was designed so that I had very positive aspirations of I was going to make it. Right? I was going to have no trouble on my way to get here. And when I got to the airport parking garage, I locked the car. Why? Because I participated in my own defense. I didn't leave my iPad on the dash of that car to essentially put a lure there so that somebody might come and say, here's some free goods, some freeware. I took the role of participating in my own defense seriously because I know that that's an obligation on me, that this system is built for me to participate in, but I have to play a role. If I worry about one thing above all others in our cybersecurity strategy, whether it's the one we've written down or whether it's the one we actually practice on a daily basis, it's not a rogue nation, it's not Russia, it's not criminals who operate in sanctuaries. They are a real and material threat. It's the complacency or perhaps the proactive ambivalence on the part of us when many of us observe something's gone wrong in this space, something is happening, something's amiss. There clearly is smoke pouring forth from some closet. And we then imagine that there must be some champion that's going to fix that for us. Somebody's going to do something about that. This is a moment where there's a role for everybody, according to each and every capability. The federal government, for its part, has taken that role now increasingly seriously, built on the work of previous administrations as well. First, get its own house in order. There was an executive order that we wrote 2 years ago to essentially do that. Second, to be proactive about projecting its support to the private sector and to work in consultation with the private sector about getting this right. But third, when necessary, to specify those non-discretional attributes of the critical systems that provide the services that our citizens care about, to say these are no longer discretionary. Market forces alone can be expected to deliver some of those, but not all of those. And we will specify and ensure that those are done right to the need necessary.
Very good. And I think that's one of the more surprising things for me, and everything came out pleasantly surprised about what came out of the strategy, is that we actually talked about the need for regulation. It's I had wondered, and others had wondered, will we actually go down that road and be that explicit?
And if I might, what was more surprising still is there weren't 67 op-eds the day after saying this is a sin against humanity. Why? Because the strategy was developed after 400 engagements of the various and sundry parties who would have to play a role in that strategy. The best strategy is not one that's actually kind of delivered with kind of a sufficient fanfare and explanation that most people in the room say, oh, get it, thanks very much for giving it to me at the last minute and explaining it so fulsomely. The best strategy is actually developed by everybody in the room such that when it's delivered, they say, it's my strategy. I'm in it, right? I've influenced it. Now, you can't do that across 400 stakeholders, let alone 330 million Americans, and not make some choices. But in each and every one of those choices that we made, we explained those choices. We kind of defended the reconciliation of the disparate choices in a way that now most folks, not everyone, but most folks have said, I get it. This is a reasonable kind of agreement going forward. It is aggressive enough. We can make some headway, but there's a role to be played by everybody in the room.
Yeah, well said. And I think there's this growing realization that more is going to have to be done in this respect to making us more secure. And I think case in point, and I've seen this going back from when I first started in this 2007, 2008, it became readily apparent that one of the best things we could do to better inoculate ourselves against cyber threats is to share cyber threat information. And to me, it seems like a no-brainer. And then when we talk to private industry about this, the lawyers in the various capacities said, we're not sharing because of fear of anti-competitive practices and monopoly power laws, and so we're not going to share until it's legal to do so. Even though the Justice Department had said we're not going to prosecute for cybersecurity purposes, if you're sharing rather for cybersecurity purposes. But even with that guidance from the Justice Department, they still wouldn't share. So we finally passed the information sharing law of 2015. By the way, not as strong as I would have liked it, but we passed that, and we thought that brought down the barriers, and that still didn't. I would have liked something that had more regulation in it, that required more information sharing, but that didn't happen. But then, most recently, we finally passed the incident reporting law that President surprised it made its way through Congress, and it seemed like the barriers to requiring at least some of that information sharing is diminishing. And so the fact that you were able to get that through, and like you said, there weren't 60 op-eds opposing it, was significant.
There's a couple of things along that road that I think were important to get to that destination. The first is there's an increasing realization that we don't have similar problems in each of the stovepipes that stands alongside each other in this place called cyberspace. We have the same problem. Right? It's not that you're experiencing kind of one problem and I'm experiencing a different problem. There's just two ends of the same problem. And I think there's an increasing awareness that we're all in the same boat, and the hole being on your side of the boat shouldn't cause me to say, you fix that, that's not my problem. Two, I think that we have seen an increasing willingness on the part of players in the past who weren't giving information that was of any use or consequences, the federal government might be one of those, to actually put actionable information in front of the actors who often aren't in the stovepipe that generated the information. Very specific case in point. On the eve of the Ukrainian conflict, the United States government clearly had intelligence that told the story about what the Russians intended to do, not just in physical space, but in cyberspace. And having kind of come into possession of that information, came to the conclusion that it's only actionable information if it's given to the actors who can deal with that. In physical space, of course, that's the Ukrainians, NATO, and some other kind of set of players who are literally going to be on the front lines of what we know ensued in Ukraine and what could have ensued on the frontiers of NATO. But in cyberspace, the actors who would be on the front lines were largely in the private sector. Think the financial entities, the energy sector, the pipeline sector, which recently had some kind of issues with respect to Russian criminal actors. The U.S. government came to the conclusion that it needed provided that information to those kind of principals so that they might then do something about it. I'll never forget the magic of the moment. One of the CEOs we were dealing with said, this is grand, this is special, this is what you might call, Chris, exquisite, because it's actionable, it's timely, it's kind of granular enough for me to do something about it. But he observed correctly, he said, but at best it's strategic warning, it's not tactical warning. It tells me that there's a thunderstorm on some near horizon. You've pointed in the cardinal heading that it's coming from, so I can look in that direction. But you haven't told me where the lightning's going to strike, right? Or what time of the day that they're going to come at me with what tool, with what instrument in their hands. And I said, that's because we don't know. And he said, well, if you won't tell me, that's fine. I said, no, we don't know. I said, we overestimate what the government knows, we underestimate what the private sector knows, and we ignore at apparel what we can only know, what we can only discover together, which is what we endeavored to do at that point. How do we actually put our subject matter experts together to figure out that tactical warning? Because the kind of the onslaught of those lightning strikes aren't as dramatic as a lightning strike in a thunderstorm. They're slow, they're insidious, they're nuanced. Right? And sometimes detecting those requires the compare and contrast of a shard of information that's possessed by one party and a hunch or perhaps an insight that's kind of perceived by another. And only in the bowels of those various stovepipes can you put that together. Which is why we put something together called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. Forget the name or the acronym. Just think of the concept, where subject matter experts from the private sector and the public sector could stand shoulder to shoulder and say, how do I take this kind of insight, compare it to that insight, have something fire that causes us to discover, and then be able to deal with something that no one of us could have discovered alone. That is a fundamentally different approach than what we've been taking over the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's not to say that prior administrations haven't made enormous progress. They have. But that's to say that the culmination of all that leads us to the place where we either collaborate or we continue to do what I would describe as a division of effort, which is an agreement to not collaborate and be picked off one at a time. The premise is, what if we made them beat all of us to beat one of us? That's a new deal. That's a very different place to be, and which is where we've tried to get to in this new strategy.
Well said. Is there anything else that you want to elaborate on in the public-private partnerships? That was a real major emphasis in the
No, just to say that public-private partnership needs to respect privacy and proprietary interest, needs to be done in a way that does not suppress innovation. And so we need to take a high degree of consultation from the private sector about what are the critical elements of the sectors that we would perhaps bring order and discipline to in terms of inherent cyber resilience. Oftentimes the government's perspective, might be that the critical thing is in the culmination and operational environment. When the private sector was saying, you missed that, by that time it's too late to actually do anything meaningful to kind of change the result. You need to go a little bit further upstream and touch perhaps the commodity that flows into that supply chain. I know that's sufficiently ambiguous to leave you wondering what I mean, but to say that without the advice and counsel of the private sector, unless they can suggest some of the questions, we can't possibly come to some of the answers that are necessary to guide a collaboration.
Sure, great. One of the things I've always, in my journey in understanding the vulnerabilities in cyberspace comes down to the fact that there's a rush to market versus secure to market strategy. And I know that one of the strategy recommendations that was received the most attention is a proposal to establish liability for software products and services. And in your mind, what kinds of manufacturers and software publishers and what kinds of software development practices should be covered under such a regime?
Well, the focus at the moment, if you look at extant regulation, almost always is on the operational phase, the folks who actually operate kind of the businesses that we describe as critical. So it might be the telecommunications companies, the banks, the finance companies, the energy companies, and yet they're using commodity capabilities, whether it's hardware, software, or devices. Increasingly, the Internet of Things is the Internet of everything. They're using stuff that's built way upstream of them. And the properties that they're trying to actually employ in a resilient and robust way have been defined in a way that the opportunities they have to bias that are limited. So we need to go a little bit further upstream. No one of us, when we actually want to go visit Amazon.com, wants the domain name server, don't need to understand what that is, just know that's the phone book that looks up where is that thing actually. We don't want that to fail in the moment because we want that product or service. Or when we say, I want to go to my Bank of America account, I just put Bank of America in that tagline up on the browser. I want it to actually go to the literal technical address on the internet. The domain name servers that are underneath all of that make that magic happen, they have worked almost flawlessly for the better part of 30 years. We want that kind of resilience. We want that resilience in the cloud. When you buy a pound of the cloud, I know you don't buy it that way, but when you buy a pound of the cloud, we want the kind of confidence that when I put something in it and I pull something out of it, it will have the properties that I expect. That my information will not have been modified along the way. It will not have been seen by people that I don't want to have seen it. And that it's going to be available to me within whatever the terms of service that I have are. But too often those terms of service and those expectations are not levied on the commodity providers, such that the operators are left with, how do I actually substitute for the lack of that resilience and robustness in the operational phase? Need to push that upstream, right? We'll push that upstream to those who can and should bear it. It won't be simply because they can pay the bills, it'll be because they have the leverage, they have the opportunity to get that right. In the same way that we don't ask individual automobile vendors or individual consumers just outside of that automobile vendor to figure out how do we put air safety bags and seat belts in those cars. That's done in the design phase way upstream. In the same way that when we ultimately build an airplane, we have a supply chain that feeds that the parts are inherently resilient and robust so that when you construct an airplane based on those parts, you get the result that you expect. You don't find some critical flaw in some single point of failure later that ultimately kind of kills you. Airplanes have gotten to the point now where the operational use of those airplanes is the principal source of risk, not the materiel that actually populates those. We need to address both, of course, in cyber, the way they do that in aviation. But I think that we've not done enough on either of those way upstream in the early parts of the supply chain.
Very good. And can you, on this kind of related topic, you were there when the executive order was developed and issued. How can the government, the federal government, be more of a market driver of stronger cybersecurity? I know, for example, in the executive order, the SBOM was in there, so the software bill of materials now is going to be required when vendors sell to the federal government. What more could we be doing in there?
Well, federal government needs to have a certain humility in this regard. We don't have the buying power we once did in terms of driving the technology markets. There was a moment in time when NASA in the 1960s, if it specified something and said this is the way this is going to be done, or if the Department of Defense, which largely held kind of the majority of major processing power and processing centers, if it drove something, then the remaining 10, 20, 30% of the market had no choice but to go with them. So we need to be humble about that. That being said, the federal government should at least be an example of kind of doing what it describes others should do. And so the executive order you described, it's Executive Order 14028, but essentially came out in about May of 2021, says that for the federal government's purposes, that those basic properties that should be installed in a digital infrastructure that make it inherently resilient and robust are no longer discretionary. We're going to have multi-factor authentication. We're going to have encryption of data at rest. We're going to run analytics on top to make sure we understand what anomalies are in that system. Most computer security specialists would say, though, those are the table stakes. That's what you should do just to create a basic defensible architecture. We've taken that aboard. And we've pushed that out through our supply chains using our buying power to say that if you're going to deal with the federal government, that you need to actually provide us those things built in. The hope is that we'll then have a knock-on effect, either by example, or hopefully kind of some vendors will say, I don't want to build two versions of this product, so I'll just build one. But I don't know that the federal government can do that based on its buying power alone. What then I think needs to happen is that we use that kind of as an exemplar. It's not the only one. There are other governments doing the same. There are companies doing the same. But use that as an exemplar to say, how do we then work through the various critical elements of our infrastructure to say, what then are the extensions of that practice into this critical infrastructure? There'll very likely be baseline requirements that say that these are the common goods, the common attributes across any architecture. Good, solid identification, authentication, good, perhaps, analytics that understand what anomalies exist in the system. But there'll be extensions of that that are unique to the electrical sector, unique to the finance sector, unique to a pipeline sector, which again, with a high degree of consultation using what are described as the sector risk management agencies, there is a defined agency or federal entity for each one of those that is supposed to work kind of hand in glove with those to figure out what the extensions of that are. Again, this is a journey. We've defined perhaps the first 2, 3, 4 steps. The buying power alone isn't going to take it the distance, but it will be, I think, a seed from which the rest of that can grow.
Okay, so thank you. Thanks for the insight on that. Maybe just 2 more questions, and I'd like to get to audience participation questions. I know that you and I have had this discussion many times, both in Solarium and after. We can have all the right structure and policies in place, and I think we're at a very strong place right now. We've got a lot of the right structure with ONCD and CISA and U.S. Cyber Command and State Department and Cyber and Digital Policy Bureau there at State. But at the end of the day, and the right policies, I think, are being put in place. But at the end of the day, you need the right people to do the job to execute these missions and execute the policies. So during your tenure as National Cyber Director, ONCD began work on a national cyber workforce and education strategy. And strengthening and expanding our workforce is obviously fundamental to securing the nation in cyberspace, since cybersecurity strategies, policies, and plans only go so far without the right people and implementation. And by most estimates, we have tens of thousands of unfilled cybersecurity positions, as you know, in the country. What in your mind do we need to do now to close that gap?
If that were the whole of the problem, it'd be a happy day, right? It's actually, it's worse than that. You've been very generous in actually kind of downplaying how significant a problem that is. Go back to the premise, which is that if cyber is more than technology, it's technology. Getting it right means you got to get the technology right. You got to get the people skills in the right place. I'll come back to that. And you have to get the role assignments right. And you probably have to do that in the reverse order. If we don't know up front who's responsible, who's accountable for what, then we have no reason to believe that we'll be coherent in the application of these very diverse capabilities and authorities, which are not in a vertical where somebody with a megaphone can say, you do A and you do Z, and somebody does everything in between. It requires some understanding of how do we actually apply these things in a way that's inherently complementary, because we all understand what our role assignments are. The National Cybersecurity Strategy is intended to be a framework to help us do that. So we got to get the roles assignments right. Got to get the people skills right, and you've spoken to one element of that, which is if you look at the jobs in the United States, but this is the same everywhere you look. Doesn't matter whether you look in the private sector, the public sector, or any other nation, we're typically about 1/3 short filling the jobs that have the word IT, information technology, or cyber in them. In the United States, I think that figure at the moment is probably in the order of about 500,000 people short, right? And so we have to fill those jobs. But we probably ought to re-examine whether those jobs have been properly defined in the first place. May well be you don't need a computer scientist to be, you don't need to be a computer scientist to be a chief information security officer. Some of the best computer information, or kind of information security officers that I've met are actually good critical thinkers first and foremost. They have a knowledge that is sufficient to kind of build a technical architecture, but then they also know how to deploy, employ, leverage, and deploy kind of a broad array of disciplines to figure out how to sustain that over time. So let's look at those jobs again and figure out what are the right criteria, not to kind of lower the common denominator, but to actually focus on what do we really need so that we're actually recruiting and inspiring people who have those skills to come to those jobs. On the other end of that, let's appeal to the broadest possible population. I think I read one study that said that the majority of children, by the time they reach 8th or 9th grade, have not been told in a fulsome way what a cyber career might be for them. Most of them have been told, you don't like math, you don't like computer science, you ought to turn to some other corner. They've been kind of turned off from it because they've not met the kind of archetype of what it means to be a cyber or an IT specialist. That doesn't work. I remember, I think, the person who kind of started the first competition across the country and taught kids that it's fun to have robots kill other robots or robots to do these new and novel things. He wasn't actually kind of teaching them about robots. He was teaching them about science, technology, engineering, and math, but it was a clever way to actually get them to do it. We need to do something similar for kids so that they kind of get excited about these possibilities, and we have a much larger population that aspires to take those jobs on, which are high-paying, valuable, respected jobs. And in between, we need to help them transition from their aspiration to the destination. Still true that if you show up in many places with a computer science degree in hand, even from Brown University, you won't be hired unless you have experience to match. Right? Computer science degree plus 3 years experience, plus 4 years experience. That's just a little bit crazy. Right? You ought to hire for the aptitude that's demonstrated by that certificate and then train for the skills that are required or the muscle memory that's required. So we need to get serious about that. We're putting our money where our mouth is. Last summer, we convened a summit at the White House to talk about that particular issue. Secretaries of Labor and Commerce stood up and said that we're going to fast-track internship programs. Since then, I think that we've got something upwards of 7,000 kids, don't hold me to it, but it's in that neighborhood. 7,000 people that are in those internship programs that otherwise wouldn't have existed that are on their way to kind of useful, meaningful jobs. Does that fill 500,000 jobs? Absolutely not. But you can actually see that blip on the radar screen. But there are two other populations. That's the folks that literally have IT or cyber in their job titles. There's two other populations. There's the many kind of disciplines whose choices implicate cyber futures all day, every day. CEOs who come out of MBA programs, lawyers who come out of law programs, logisticians who come out of so on and so forth. Their curricula has been developed over millennia. I walked into a company once that had a pratfall where the IT people had failed to patch something. It had gone down hard. The company then suffered some very significant consequences associated with that. And we queried the IT people, why did you not patch that? I mean, it was self-evident, you should patch that. So we wanted to patch that. But the operations team wouldn't let us do that because they're in charge, right? They're the ones that run the business. They said, you can't patch those systems until you prove to us that the patch doesn't have any negative consequences. It was the fact that the operations people, who largely came out of MBA programs or logistician programs, the people who didn't know what risk they were taking took the risk and expected the people who were expected to mitigate the risk to understand that without knowing the risk had been taken. I mean, that is a problem because the people who depend on digital infrastructure to do their jobs don't know what the implication of their choices is. We don't need them all to be Python programmers. None of them need to be Python programmers. But they need to know what the consequences are of the choices they make dependent upon digital infrastructure. So let's get into those programs and give them at least kind of a passing familiarity. They're not digital natives, they're app natives. Well, we're all app natives more than we're digital natives. We don't know what a cloud is. We don't know what a pound of it looks like. We don't know what its properties are and who's defending it. We should know a little bit more. I want to teach my kids as much about cyber as I teach them about crossing a city street or managing a hot stove. Just that. Let's step up to average on that. And then there's the last crowd, which is everybody. Everybody needs to know more about cyberspace than they know just by being raised in its proximity. Again, we are not digital natives for the most part. Even the youngest of us, we're app natives because the stuff is so intuitive. It exceeds our expectations simply by looking at it in ways that we don't think about the inherent resilience and robustness of it. And we think then somebody must have thought about that. Somebody must have tended to it. We now know that many people have not. Right? And so how do we actually make it such that you ask those intelligent questions about it the same way you do about when you get in your car and you see the air safety bag light is on? What does that mean? I think I care about that. What's the equivalent of that in cyberspace that's easy, intuitive, and that we train everybody to do so that they participate in their own defense? There's an all, a many, and a few. The few is the 500,000 kind of approach to this. The strategy you spoke of is trying to take all of those on in the same way that we did for the National Cybersecurity Strategy. How do you mobilize all of the stakeholders in this regard, bring together academia, the businesses who ultimately employ them, ultimately fund the transition from aspiration to destination, and the federal government that has both convening power and some degree of influence over the standards that might be affected to bring that about. We have to solve that problem because if we don't solve the people problem, all the technology in the world is just going to be something that bedazzles us but doesn't solve it.
Well said. Agreed. So I'll pause there for my questions, and let's open it up to anybody in the audience who might have questions.
I have a question for you, sir.
Same question?
No, it's a new one.
Oh, good.
What advice would you give to computer science departments on how to not only educate those students who are going to come out with a computer science degree, but also those students who are not aware that they can contribute in the ways you've indicated?
That's a great question. Maybe two pieces of advice, and again, I think I'm speaking to the choir here, so let's hum along in the same tune. First, I would quote Andy Phillips. You know Andy Phillips from the Naval Academy, who's kind of ABET fame. He led the effort to develop cyber science criteria for ABET. But he once kind of said to me something that it was just earth-shattering. I thought, that's it? He said, cyber is not one and the same, or kind of a subset of computer science. Cyber is computer science practiced in the presence of an adversary. Now, that adversary might be a squirrel chewing into a electrical grid. It might be nature, kind of a hazard. It might be a human being. But we need to think about computer science plus as being what cyber is. And how do we get that right? And so computer science needs to be, I wouldn't say humble, but reflective about there's a very important contribution to be made by computer scientists, but we can't get these systems right unless we add in some operational theory, right? Some perhaps some theory about what are the legal constraints, the legal obligations, and so on and so forth. So most cyber science programs that I see, or cyber programs that I see that really are kind of operating at full capacity, have a healthy component of computer scientists, so we understand the technology underpinnings. How do you get that right? They have some legal experts that say, and this is the framing of this is how this society actually does that. They have some operational specialists that say, I can think my way through how an adversary thinks about this so that I can actually understand what both sides of this are doing because they're both on the field at the same time. That's the first thing that I would say. Second thing I would say is, even if you're just kind of heads down thinking about computer science, think about the implications of what you build in terms of the long-term tail of that. I'll give you an analogy and then come back to main point. I was trained as a mechanical engineer in the days of a slide rule, right? So I was happy once, really happy once. And when I was trained as a mechanical engineer, I could have gone out and built systems that spewed toxins into an adjacent river or spewed all manner of kind of effluents into the atmosphere that would have caused great harm, and that wouldn't have been my problem. Would not have been commendable, but it would not have been my problem because my job was very narrowly framed. That's no longer the case. in a mechanical engineering program today, or an engineering program of any consequence, we teach people kind of social responsibility, ecological responsibility. We teach all of that as a foundational kind of value that we instill in them to say, you are accountable for the effect your system has, not just on the primary purpose, but the secondary kind of, sometimes it is the primary effect, right, that we're thinking our way through. We need to be the same with respect to computer scientists. The coding that showed up in Log4j, right, was built kind of across eons of time. And many of those pieces of code performed ably and well. And for those who haven't been following that, this is an open source software library. The people drop something in there that has some function, right? And it can be reused time and time and time again by large coders. And they pull that module out and they make use of it. And much of the code that was installed on there had a common flaw that I'm not sure that I could have forecast what that was. It wasn't that somebody was ignoble in the creation of that, but they didn't think their way through, how might this be used? Am I accountable? Does my name attach to the inherent resilience and robustness of that? So whether you get a certificate for coding or a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science with a focus on hardware, firmware, or anything else out there, we need to teach them that if you don't attend to the inherent resilience and robustness, it might be that we've missed our first and last chance. I would just give that message to them. I still think it's true, you can correct me on this, that a computer science degree requires that there be a discussion of computer security, but not necessarily a hands-on application of computer security, that you actually have to code it. And I know that I studied device drivers forever as a computer scientist. It wasn't until I wrote one that I understood what it was all about. It's like, oh my goodness, now I know, right? And I just think the practical experience is so important. What would you add to that?
No, I wouldn't add much at all to it. I think it's a brilliant summary. And I asked the question because I'm now retired, and I'm happy that you told my former colleagues.
To bring you back and have you do that.
Right. Well, I was doing it. I spent a year in the State Department in the Cyber Affairs Office and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Then I came, not having been exposed to cybersecurity before going down, when I came back, I needed to enhance my understanding of the subject by teaching. So I taught a course called Cybersecurity and International Relations. And I had, most of my students were not computer scientists. And when they came to the course, they were delighted to know that they could contribute to the computer science problem, cybersecurity problem, in all the ways in which you've discussed.
I agree. Thank you. Sir.
Tim Edgar, I teach here at Brown also. And I guess the good news is Brown has a master's degree in cybersecurity now, Master of Science in cybersecurity, and there's a policy track that does not require a computer science undergraduate degree. Any of you here who are seniors should know there's still time. You can apply by May 1st for that degree program. And it can be taken online and remotely, so you don't even have to stay in Providence if you don't want to. So I think we're getting there. I feel like we're getting there more slowly than we should be. In terms of these kinds of closing that gap you're talking about. I guess my question just goes back to the national strategy, and that is, regulation and liability were really dirty words in Washington for at least going back to the Clinton years of the 90s. And I looked at strategies going back to Clinton, and every single one of them without fail said, we don't want to do regulation or liability. And then Biden comes along and says, maybe we do. And I had the same positive reaction that Jim Langevin did. And I'm curious, did you get much pushback inside the administration for those words? What do you think allowed that shift to finally happen? Because there has been regulation and liability in this area, but the national strategy has always been very laissez-faire.
So three things. One, we've tried everything else. We've tried the laissez-faire approach. We've tried to just English this thing. It's like just go. It just won't do it, right? Self-enlightenment, market forces take you a certain distance. They never take you kind of to a place that is durable and certain if life, health, and safety depend on it. It just isn't enough, right? And just bubbles kind of are created by that, and those market forces are not as sensible as a human being might be who has the accountability of the health and safety of what then results to a human being. Two, we had hard discussions, a lot of hard discussions about that, about what are the alternatives, kind of gaming it and kind of brainstorming it. It's like, is there any other way? Which then resulted in coming together with the formulation of it isn't regulation for regulation's sake. It's regulation as an extension of those other life forces that still must be used and used in that order. Self-enlightenment, market forces, and then when necessary, only when necessary, to the extent necessary, lightest possible touch, but no lighter, regulation. We put the R word in there with a capital R. We said it's there. It's not maybe, it's in there. But it's got to be done with consultation of those who will be regulated, and it's got to be harmonized, which was the third part, which was we then took that premise before we actually put it in the document out to the private sector and said, this is what we're going to do, and we need your help to get it right. Right? We are inexorably, we're going to do this, right? But we need your help to get it right. And they recognized that that was the truth of the matter. And you can imagine who the leading proponents were of don't do it at all. But you know, we said, we are going to do this, but you need to help us do this right. And it was, I think, a difficult discussion, but we were honest and transparent and candid up front to the degree that we could. You don't always give away your whole playbook. But at the end of the day, our expectation was that the day after it came out, we wouldn't get 67 op-eds, and we didn't, because everybody knew what was going to be in it the day before. So,
Congratulations, because that is a difficult that is a difficult dance to do, and you did it quite well.
In the center right there.
Nicole Picard, I'm an Associate General Counsel in Brown's Office of General Counsel, and my portfolio here at the university primarily supports the research enterprise. So on the theme of regulations, we're consistently watching what our funders are doing, NSF, NIH, NASA, DoD, et cetera. Implementation of NSPM 33, National System Security Presidential Memorandum 33, and how that's coming down, so all of that. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, perhaps more broadly, on the role of research institutions in all of this, and the impact also on research institutions of all of this, and how we should be thinking about that.
well, the role of research institutions clearly must be to help us kind of innovate our way through kind of finding solutions for some of these hard problems. You know, I tell you that one of the biggest problems still is how do you enter into collaboration across these disparate entities, some of whom are competitors? How do you enter into that and take advantage of the information that they and they alone know without actually sacrificing either their intellectual property or their competitiveness? There's some really hard research problems in there. How do you do that, right, and get that right? Remember that back to that tactical warning almost always comes from that degree of collaboration as opposed to strategic warning, which can come from one party that stands above the fray. Tactical warning really is the coin of the realm in terms of dealing with the undulating nature of this landscape. So that's a big research thing, and there are a whole lot of others. How are we going to make use of artificial intelligence? How are we going to connect the human being to artificial intelligence so that we never devolve the accountability from the human to the machine in a way that we find unacceptable kind of in the bargain? Only the research institutions can help us understand what the art of the possible is in that regard. To the extent that you're getting regulations that begin to suppress your ability to innovate and to explore and to find kind of new and innovative ways, you need to raise a hand to say, hey, I understand what the intent of this is, but this one is curbing my ability to deliver what you want. And we need to realize we live in a world where others are going to do it. That shouldn't motivate us to do the wrong thing. But we should make sure that we're staying apace with how these things might be abused or misused against us. That's a role for research as well, because we perhaps lack a fair of imagination about how some of these things might be employed if somebody has a completely different kind of sense of what the compact is between a government and their people or a government and another government. So those are some ways where I can think of that research should be kind of in this. But when I earlier said that there needs to be a high degree of consultation between government and the private sector, I mean by extension of that with academia, and oftentimes the core, the center of that is in the research components. So.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Don Kassler. I'm a postdoc here at Watson, and I'm a political scientist by trade. I was really struck by your automobile analogy because one of the things I study is information operations or influence operations, the ways in which states compete in cyberspace and also kind of on social media to try and win the narrative, right? It seems like what we really need to be doing is cultivating better responsibility sort of at a vast unit level for being able to kind of diagnose what's good information and what's not good information. But when so much of what's kind of traveling on the digital infrastructure is garbage, basically, at the end of the day, I guess I want to push you on some of the things you
I agree.
suggested. How can we train people to be better
agree.
about this?
I agree. None of what I described in terms of creating that system of systems that is the highway transportation system and cars and buses and things inside of it, prevent somebody from driving drunk, prevent somebody from speeding. I mean, there are all sorts of human behaviors that can be excessive on top of that. All it can do is to create a foundation on which responsible human behavior can result in the kind of the conditions and outcomes that we seek. But humans can still abuse the privilege and go a distance. And that's where culture takes over. There could be some incentives for that culture. There could be perhaps some early kind of framing that kind of establishes at the dinner table and other places, this is your responsibility. And there could be consequences you bring to bear for bad behavior. But that is beyond the kind of ability of the system to absolutely control. It's true and then some in cyberspace. Right? I have a model that I sometimes describe, and I'll very quickly do this. I know we don't have the time, but many of us have been focused on how do we defend data and systems. I'm going to look down because there are 3 levels of this model. How do we defend data and systems? And it's a pretty tried and true set of capabilities to defend the confidentiality, the availability, the integrity of data and systems. But that's really not the game. What we care about those data and systems for is to effect the critical functions that live on top of that. And if you want to defend the critical functions, the delivery of electricity, the conduct of an election, and so on and so forth, you have to imagine there's something more going on there than the literal use of data or systems. There's typically a coalition or a collaboration between multiple parties to conceive, design, deploy, and sustain the system of interest. Elections in the United States are essentially conducted by a group of 54 states and territories, and even further devolved down to communities. If you're going to defend that election, you have to form a coalition amongst them so that they understand what the common aspiration is, the common hazards are, give them some kind of infrastructure and some knowledge so that they can defend themselves together in a way that no one of them can defend themselves alone. But on top of that, there's a third thing that's under assault within cyberspace, which is the confidence, or perhaps maybe even the psychology of those who depend upon those first 2 levels. Take the election within the United States in 2016, 18, 2022, right? What I think the Russians were up to, not official position, this is a Chris Inglis position, was not to change votes from column A to column B, but to get us to doubt whether a free and open kind of society based on a free and open internet would deliver an appropriate, accurate result. Right? Let's cause some doubt about whether this democracy is representing our interest in the way the framers of the Constitution intended. If we're going to address that, we have to make sure the first 2 levels don't lead us into the dark corners. So we've got to get the first 2 levels I described right. Defend data and systems, defend critical functions. But on top of that, we must have a powerful, transcendent view of what this democracy is. We must have an idea that defeats that counter idea, that defeats that disinformation. Cyber is not going to deliver that. People are going to deliver that. And that therefore requires something more, right, that lives on top of that. Cyber can hold it at risk. Cyber can't deliver it. A car can make it such that you can drive safely from point A to point B. It doesn't guarantee it. You have to participate in that. You have to actually do something on top of that. It's based more on the human activity than the technological activity underneath of that. So I absolutely agree with you. And we have not addressed that, nor can we address that with technology alone. And woe be to us if we try to modulate the content inside of that space such that we get to a place where one or more of our factions are happy with it. First Amendment would immediately stand in, I think, but I'm not a lawyer. I've read it. So is that the question you've asked?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You have time for one more? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm a computer science undergrad. And as someone who spent a little bit of time doing cybersecurity work inside and outside of the government, I'm curious when you're navigating all the stakeholders involved with the intelligence community, whether you've noticed any sort of talent, interest, or resource allocation gap between those interested in offensive capability buildup and the more defensive-oriented strategy, I think.
Oh, it's a really good question. Yeah, offense is always more exciting. It's like, so you get kind of like all sorts of lightning and heat and electricity kind of, extend from that. But what I honestly think, what I honestly see is that there's a much, much bigger appetite now for defense because that's where the durable effect is felt, right? That the defense now is increasingly seen as that is the predicate to anything that we might do offensively. And I would tell you that the Ukrainians have taught us, me, and others a lot about that. Defense is the new offense, right? In terms of their defense of their digital infrastructure, first they've shown that offense is harder than it looks. The Russians are not as capable in offensive campaigns as we might have thought. They're pretty good at sucker punches, remember, not petcha, and other things. But they're not good at synchronized kind of campaigns because the instrumentation is required, the synchronization is required, the delegation of initiative that's required. So offense is not as easy as it looks. Defense then can hold its own if you've got a technical architecture that has sufficient agility. They don't have a perfect technical architecture. They don't have the one you would prefer to go to war with, but it works. It's got enough agility in it. They've got amazing expertise. And who knew that the Russians were training the Ukrainians for the better part of the last 9 years by wailing away at them every day, all day, every day. Ukrainians are actually quite good at cyber defense. And 3, the Ukrainians have built this coalition across the private and public sectors such that the Russians have to beat Microsoft, ESET, Cisco, Elon Musk, Starlink terminals, NATO, and the Ukrainians and some number of other parties. So defense has now taken on a whole new kind of degree of importance and I think increasing respect. And so across the government that I have seen and worked in, there's a lot of people saying, I think I'd like to be on the defensive team because that's where the cool stuff happens. So
That fits in great with the some of the findings of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which 3 pillars were to shape behavior, deny benefits, and impose costs. And when you can deny benefits, that in and of itself is a strong defensive or offensive strategy, right? If the bad guys can't get in, they don't benefit. So, very good. Well, we've come upon our time. I will just commend you again for being able to get the national cyber strategy through the interagency process, and I'd love to have you just kind of close out and talk about that process again. You did touch on it, but I know there was not everybody was enthusiastic, at least one individual, and yet because of the how you socialize this, when it came time to conclude the process, really there was any opposition was overridden because of that collective effort.
I'd just say, it's as in most things in cyber, it's a team sport, right? So if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, take the team. And having taken a team which kind of greatly transcended the federal government alone, all the agencies and departments had an early and frequent opportunity to influence through 5 versions of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. Version 1 was a box of parts, right? So it was incoherent to the max. Version 2 began to aggregate, make some choices. Version 3 got to be something that looks a lot like version 5. But the hard work then began of, so how do we actually make it such that this is then a complementary set of parts? Then worked that across to 400 engagements in all. About 2/3 of those were in the private sector, such that at the end of that stream, I think I'd said this earlier, there were any number of people that said, this is my strategy, I'm in it. I might not have the words that I preferred, but I had a full and fair opportunity to influence this. And they came back to me every time and told me why I'm either in or why I've just gotten kind of excised out. And so I feel like some sense of ownership of this. And late in the process, somebody came in late who had the authority to do so, at least the presumed authority to do so, and said, I don't know that I like this at all. I'd like to careen into this and change, a lot of things to a lot of, parts. And what happened was there was this meeting of some fairly kind of significant parties across the federal bureaucracy, and one of them stood up and said, you're not actually talking about the Office of the National Cyber Director strategy or Chris Inglis' strategy, you're talking about my strategy. And everybody else in the room said the same thing. And for quite some time, I have been saying, in the public domain, it's a pithy little phrase, and I don't know where I got it, but somebody else said it first. What if they had to beat all of us to beat one of us? And it turns out I learned that on that day, that's true. It works, right? If you have to beat all of us to beat one of us. So again, if you want to go far, take the team. And that's never been more true than it is in cyber, because it's not a vertical, right? So we're perennially in what the government would call an interagency meeting. Nobody in the room is in your vertical. You can't order them what to do, right? You have to actually convince them that there's common cause, there's a common aspiration, common cause, common thread, and then mobilize them to bring the talent that they brought from outside the room, inside the room, throw away the scoreboard they're trying to defend, attach themselves to the one scoreboard of what it is we're going to do, so that you don't have 20 players operating at cross purposes trying to put points on 20 different scoreboards. That's the insanity of an interagency, a bad interagency meeting. So you need to make it such that you take a Star Wars bar and you say, hey, we've all got a common goal here, let's defeat the Empire. So the Empire is real and material, it helps us every day in terms of mobilizing our time and attention. I appreciate the work that you have done, Congressman Langevin. I think you were the first one to suggest a national cyber director back in 2010. It's I may have heard it at the time. I had no idea that I was implicated in the plot. But I have enjoyed being in your influence and your sway ever since, and so thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much. Great discussion. Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.